I've really never had such a sudden change of roles. I was asked to moderate a discussion. It's probably the first time in my life I would be doing that. But then I suddenly realized that the speaker who may have matched the abilities of Sitaram and given you the virtues of the free market, the satellite link prevented him from joining you. And then 5 minutes ago, I was told that my job as a moderator had been taken away and I should now speak for the free market. Well, not that I grudge the position that I have been put into. Let me start with the question that Rohit just now put to you, when he said, discuss what happened from the 50s to the 90s. I remember a couple of years ago explaining to my two children, who are both students yet, as to the lucky environment in which they've been brought up. And when they wanted to know what happened when I went to school myself, and that was not in the 40s or the 50s, I was talking of the situation of the 1960s, college in the early 70s. I said, in the family, and belonging then to a middle-class family, the previous evening responsibilities used to be distributed as to which member of the family would go at some 5 o'clock in the morning to stand in a queue to get milk. And then we lived through an era of shortages. Till the 70s, you needed a letter from a member of parliament, till the 90s about your gas coupons and so on, or your telephone allotments. But till the 70s, you also needed it if you needed to buy an HMT watch out of turn. Well, probably that was a force of circumstances. We didn't have the adequate kind of investment, nor was the environment there. We were a regulated economy. But one of the features of that regulated economy was that those who were entitled to grow or allowed to grow at the discretion of the state also managed to make sure that the others in competition did not grow. So if you wanted a two-wheel vehicle or a four-wheel vehicle, your choice was limited, the quality was inadequate. And if that was the 50s to the 90s, what happened after the 90s? Suddenly you found the unleashing of the energies of an Indian. And when you found this unleashing of the energies, and I won't say that will be an exaggeration if I say that it happened across the board, but it happened with several sectors. We started growing, and suddenly we realized the virtues of growing faster. Now, it may be reasonably argued, and that's a valid viewpoint which is put across, how quickly did these benefits percolate downwards? Was the dripping effect of this entire growth rate process, how much did it benefit the average citizen, or the Aam Aadmi as some preferred to call him? Well, from a huge percentage of population, close to 60, at the time when we became independent, which lived below the poverty line, this figure certainly has depleted much faster when the growth rates have grown. One of the excellent examples of growth rate growing and its advantage to the average citizen, when we give examples of what happened in the telecom revolution, or what happened to the auto sector, what happened when the airlines were opened out, it's normally argued that these are all advantages which have percolated and which have benefited only a segment of the economy. You had better facilities, you had better services, you did away with shortages, the consumer had plurality of choice, competition did bring prices down, provided better services. But one of the more recent examples, I thought, was what was also happening in the railways. An 8% growth rate scenario, if it substantially increases the income and the earning of the railways, how the benefits could be transformed itself and transferred to the traveling public. Beyond a point, however cynical we are, I always have this question in my mind: do I trust the markets more? Do I trust my governments more? When my governments regulated the entire economy and controlled my energies, did they prevent me from growing? Or will the markets, at least in a large number of segments, provide solutions? Well, then there is, when Rohit asked what is the right mix, there is significantly still an important role for the government in all this. In a more liberal mood, we say the government must be a facilitator, the government must be a policy layer, the government must encourage by creating an environment where all this can happen. Needless to say, that's an important role of the government. But then there are two significant other roles of the government also. In sectors where investment has been relatively a little slow, or a public-private partnership is the need of the hour, and I am referring directly to infrastructure, the government has a very important role to play. The power sector today is one phase of infrastructure which is still not growing at a pace at which we would have expected it to grow. Government's roles in the rural roads programs, the expansion of the ports, in a policy domain, the proposed expansion of the airports. These are all areas where the government's role as a policy maker has been there. But then the government also has a second role. And that alternative role always has been that those sections of the society which are not able to benefit entirely from this growth process, and where the dripping effect itself will take years, if not decades, to reach, the various poverty alleviation schemes of the government must be effectively implemented in order to reach that segment. There is still a second part of the subject where I must confess that I personally hold slightly more conservative views. If domestic liberalization, reliance on the market, reliance on the potential of your entrepreneurs has served the country well, that's our experience of the last 15 odd years. And the formulation of that has been very clear. You create an environment where both your domestic and the world entrepreneur wants to invest. You generate economic activity. You create jobs. You create avenues for greater revenue for the government. You create an environment for profitability in business. And I certainly must confess I am one of those who don't consider profitability as a bad word. There'd be no growth process without it. And an enriched government with larger revenues then creates better infrastructure, which attracts greater investment. That's how the economic activity goes on. And an enriched government then also has adequate money in its pockets. It has deeper pockets in order to look at those segments of the society which have otherwise been ignored in the growth process. But then I said there is a second area where I would be a little more conservative. How do we deal with the markets opening internationally in all fields? And I think over the last 1 decade, the situation from an Indian point of view has substantially changed. The world today prefers to buy goods And the world today prefers to buy services from whichever sources they can get them cheaper and of better quality. That really today is the essence of what we call in a generalized phrase globalization. If you are in a position to prepare to market your goods and your services, both in terms of quality and pricing at a very competitive value, the world is going to buy them. And that's what's going to put you at an advantage. And that's probably one of the reasons why China, with the advantages of low-cost manufacturing, bulk manufacturing, is significantly benefiting as far as the manufacturing sector is concerned. And India, with a much larger knowledge resource, with a facility to provide low-cost services, is doing exceedingly well as far as the services sector is concerned. Probably with a few more reforms, even the manufacturing can become more competitive, which is much better than what it was years ago. But then these rules in a free market economy have to be fair. Markets can also be subverted, as indeed some of the developed countries in the world, the United States, the European Union, have subverted the global agricultural market. And that's a huge cause for concern to countries like India, where 60% plus of the population is still dependent on agriculture for livelihood, for its resources. And it finds a completely skewed up market, a subverted market, where the developed countries with the huge surplus resource decide to subsidize their own agriculture and allow that subsidized agriculture to compete in the global market. An uneven market would never be fair. And therefore, in an area of this kind where the market itself is unfair, as today the case is in the global agricultural market, the effect of a free market to countries like India would be counterproductive. I am therefore, even with a more liberal mold in terms of liberalizing domestic economy, I am not willing to apply a uniform yardstick to such areas where markets have been subverted, and the opening out in those cases, unless a level playing field is created, would be adverse to the case of a large number of countries. The cotton market world over. There are African economies which have been completely destroyed because of the kind of subversion in the cotton market that the United States has done. And therefore, to have a generalized suggestion that a free market in those areas would serve the markets, probably it would not. But then our limited experience in terms of our own domestic reforms have been that wherever we have chosen to open out, I think broadly the experience, barring a stray exception here or there, has been a pleasant experience. It's been a consumer-friendly experience. It's been a revenue-friendly experience. It's been an experience where the quality of life, the quality of services, the value of services have all benefited the average citizen. But then that operates in one area, as I said, the government's role in several other areas where people would need a huge amount of support. But then that support would also come if we have an enriched government. And an enriched government stands to earn always more from a freer market setup domestically within the country itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Jaitly. Let me say in retrospect that with speakers like you, I was wondering why were you not in our original scheme of things, sir? We'll come back to you. Mr. Jaitly, if I can turn to you, basically on the same three things that we discussed, if you could also, I think, sir, from your point of view, it will be even more relevant to hear if you would consider something as extreme as a description like lost decades to the 50s and 60s. I know that's not the truth, but that's to provoke you. But so more than that, there's a perception about the communist parties, which I'd be very happy if you could dispel through this forum, that there's a perception that they're frozen in time when it comes to economic policies. They just don't see the realities, both in India and outside. And therefore, they have, their influence has probably as many negatives as positives, is that to put it bluntly. Now, so in addition to sort of, in the context of free markets and masses, I would be also very grateful if you could tell us how has the communist ideology in India, and especially the political ideology, has readjusted, if at all, to the current needs. Your frame, sir. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, it's actually nice to be here at the conclave, because I don't think Rohit would have been so nice to me if he was writing for the magazine. And I could actually add a lot more things that he would have said otherwise of what we communists are all about, and the Jurassic era that we belong to, and that we have nothing to do with the present world, etc. But let me, since you posed the question that way, let me tell you from the communist point of view, and also as a trained economist, let me also tell you, and as a left economist, that it is an absolute misnomer to believe that the communists or the left is against the markets. Now, theoretically, if I may just take a minute, markets are the place where goods that are produced exchange. So long as there is commodity production, there has to be a market where these goods have to go for exchange. So whether it's under feudalism, whether it's under capitalism, whether it's under socialism, if commodities are produced, a market exists. So it's not a question of saying it's market versus a non-market or a state situation. That's ridiculous, because market exists. The question is to recognize the limitations of the market in terms of your social objectives. The one thing that the markets do not do, and here universally all economists will agree, is that markets do not enter into the area of distribution or redistribution of wealth. That is not the job of the market. Now, if your social policy is also, one of the concerns is also the question of income distribution or wealth distribution, then you have to, per se, by definition, you will have to have a policy of intervention to allow that to happen and not leave everything to the market. Now, this, in terms of theory, sounds absolutely straightforward and simple, and that is why I'm actually missing Hernando de Soto here, because I had happened to read his book 2 years ago, and he had embarked on all of us are aware, in Peru there's a very militant ultra-left movement, which at the outset, let me tell you, we don't agree with. I mean, like many other ultra-left movements in India as well, which is called the Shining Path. And Hernando was the one who coined the answer to that, saying the other path. And his seminal work, which calls about the other path, I'll come to that again. But I wish he was here, because we could actually, because I think in essence what he's argued in his book is exactly what I would argue. And which is that understanding that a market has an economic function to perform, and understanding also that the market is the only regulator in any commodity producing economy, that will tell you the mismatch between demand and supply. And that would be the corrective regulation that the market signals will send. The question that is, who will utilize these market signals and for what social objective? Now, that is an important point. There we may disagree. We may entirely disagree with the social objectives. Yes, that is the realm of disagreement in a democracy, and let's debate that. But the question is, do not deny the fact that there is an extra market element required in any society. And even in the most advanced of the capitalist societies, there is an extra market intervention required, and that is all what Keynes talked and taught all of us. What is Keynesism all about? That in terms of pure economics, a full employment equilibrium between demand and supply can never happen unless there is a state intervention. And what was Roosevelt's New Deal all about? Was exactly a state interventionist policy by which the levels of employment were increased through greater investment, which led to the post-Second World War boom in the US economy. So to ascribe as though that anything alien to the market is of the Jurassic era is actually not responding to your realities of the day. And if the questions that Rohit asked, let's go between the lost decades of the 50s to the 70s or 90s that you pointed out. Well, I've been, or at least the persuasion that I come from, the political persuasion, have been one of the worst critiques of those decades as well. in terms of economic policies. I mean, you can say we have been the permanent critiques all the while. I mean, we will always have that. No, but I won't call them lost. Because I do not think what we took off in the late 80s and the early 90s was actually on the base that was created during these decades. Let's not forget that. However inadequate, however halting, it was your self-sufficiency in food, it was your basic infrastructure in production of steel, cement, coal, all your basic things required for a takeoff were laid in that period. Yes, absolutely what Arun was saying, when we are contemporaries in that sense. We grew up around the same time, educated around the same time, the same university, and all of us know when the first fridge arrived in our house, when the first car came, and how many months we were waiting. When my father, before he got his car I still remember, 13,000 something was the first Fiat. that was given to us. For many years, I was in a middle-class home without a telephone. Television came after I grew up. I mean, it was just not existing. Yes, all these changes are there. Today, I have my 10-year-old son with an iPod. I mean, he goes on listening to his music. Yes, I mean, these things have all changed. But let us not write off that period to say that has been lost decades. No, if that was not there, we wouldn't have been able to. We could have done much better. Yes, but that was not because of the preoccupation with, let's say, state interventionist policy and an absence of attention to the market. That was because of a certain preoccupation of certain vested interests who wanted to make use of that situation for their growth. I mean, your licensing policy, I mean, every one of us knows here, I mean, who are the ones who benefited, who are the ones who were denied. I mean, all this that falls into this in another realm. It's a non-economic realm that falls into the political realm of how that regime was utilized for the perpetuation of vested interests, which is not really the subject matter of its market or non-market. But having said that, what is happening in this decade of the 90s onwards? Let's take, I mean, I'd like to, for a moment, let us look at some realities of what has happened globally first, and then I'll come to India, the other way around of what Arun did. I mean, not out of any deliberate intent to always be the other way around of what he does, but only to put it in a larger context. From the 1990s, let's say when this entire process of globalization took off, what do we have the situation compared to a decade later? 46 countries in the world have a real GDP rate which is lower than what it was in 1990. 46 countries in the world. The percentage of the world production or the world's assets for the poorest 20% of the world's population declined from 1.4%, even then it was very low, 1.4% in 1991 to less than 1% in 2000. There are today more than 1.3 billion people who live on less than $1 a day. There are today more than 3 billion people who live on less than $2 a day. And what Arun was saying about the world agrarian market, a cow in the European Union is subsidized to the tune of $2.8 a day. And you have more than 3 billion, that's more than half the world's population, living below $2 a day. Now, globalization and market economy, fine. I mean, you had all these other growths. I mean, I can give you various figures. 2004, the United Nations Development Report that's just come out has shown us that was the year of the tsunami, that was the year of the earthquakes, but which was the biggest claimant of human life? Hunger. 6 million people died in 2004 out of hunger. Now, all fine with market economy, but look at this reality, the other side around. And come to my own country. Here, the decade of the 90s and what is continuing here, which Arun and they learned it the hard way with the India Shunning campaign, not really being accepted by the people. I mean, why? I mean, there is an actual reality which we have to see. You've had the growing starvation deaths. You have distress suicides. The agrarian crisis in our country has hit a low where the per capita availability of food grain, in 2003-04, was at the same level, 151 kilos per head, when it was during the Bengal famine, just at the time of the end of the Second World War, in 1943. Now, why is all this happening as well? And that is of concern where I think we'll have to come out. In the decade of the 90s, yes, there has been a tremendous burst of creativity. There has been a tremendous burst of a new India being found by that generation, the generation immediately preceding ours, and we had a tremendous creative burst in our country. Excellent, very good. Nobody is denying it, nobody is disputing it. And neither are we from the left asking for a control on it. What we are saying is that you'll have to have a regulation of it. And that regulation will have to come into, and there the redistributive aspect is important. It is not as though poverty elevation should be seen as an act of charity by the rich for the poor. The moment you see it as an act of charity, you will fall into the same trap of saying, how much of the 100 rupees I'm giving is actually going to that person concerned? Spend that 100 rupees, instead of giving it as subsidy to them, spend it in public investment where you employ them in return for the work. And when you come to infrastructure, remember, no country in the world, whether it's the United States of A or it's the People's Republic of China, has infrastructure ever been built only by the private sector. The major player in every single country in the world for the building of infrastructure is the state. And the state cannot, therefore, abdicate this responsibility. And where the state intervention comes with the mix, the question that Rohit asked, well, what is the right mix? The state intervention's right mix arises out of a very concrete analysis of the concrete conditions in which you exist. Today, if you have, in my country, if the Planning Commission for the first time since independence accepts in writing in its midterm evaluation that in the organized sector employment has declined. If today in my country it says during the decade of the 90s that you're talking, the unemployment rate went up from 5.3% to 9%. Then these are matters of concern along with starvation deaths and distress suicides in 2/3 of our population in rural areas. So what is required is, along with the market playing its role and allowing the market to play its role in terms of channelizing this burst of creativity that we talked of in the 90s, you require a more stronger and a firmer state intervention to ensure the distributive aspects of this growth. And that is something we cannot abdicate in the name of leaving everything to the market forces. And that is why I'd strongly feel what is the right mix will depend upon your policy objectives. You have a government today, yes, and many of you jokingly, during the lunch were saying that we are also part of the government, and we actually spend a lot of energy trying to say we are not part of the government, but we are supporting this government. Yes, we are pushing the government. We want to push the government in the direction where the emphasis is not really to give or dole out money for the poor. The emphasis is actually to invest in areas where the poor can be brought into the market process. The inclusiveness of the state intervention is for what? To include those who are today excluded from the market into the market. 2/3 of Brazil today, if you go there, they live in what they call the favelas, which is their slums, out of the market. They are not part of the market at all. And Hernando de Soto, what is his whole argument in Peru? He says 3/4 of the Peruvian population is outside the market process. And in fact, he talks in terms of state intervention to bring them into the market process. And that is precisely the approach that even I would have here in order to, and here, since he's not been there, it would be unfair to, I think, but I think it's worth the while to just listen to his last paragraph of his conclusion. I'm just quoting from his book. It says, the real remedy for violence and poverty is to recognize the property and labor of those whom formality today excludes. Property and labor. So that where there is rebellion, there will be a sense of belonging and responsibility. When people develop a taste for independence and faith in their own efforts, they will be able to believe in themselves and in economic freedom. Now, this is what the great market liberalizer would finally say. And who does give them this sense of belonging? Who gives them the pride in their property and their labor? And that is where state intervention is absolutely necessary. So the right mix in India today, I would go on to suggest, will have to be a judicious mix of allowing markets to play their role, using the market signals for policy prescriptions of governmental intervention. And governmental intervention is not in terms of doling out, as I repeat, doling out resources for the sake of charity or out of sheer kindness, but it has to be in areas of public investment, social and economic infrastructure primarily, where you have a process of inclusiveness. And that is why this Rural Employment Guarantee Act, it is inadequate in our opinion. But nevertheless, it's a good beginning, that where the money is spent on developing your infrastructure simultaneously as to alleviate poverty. And here only one thing which I'd like to, I know I may be very unpopular for saying this, but you must remember there are always two types of subsidies. One, you dole out to the poor. The second, which you do not take from the rich. What you do not take from the rich is often called incentives. What you give to the poor is called subsidies, with a degree of condescension. So treat both as the same. If you want to get rid of subsidies, get rid of both. And get people, include the poor into your market process. And that is the way in which I think the mix will have to be worked out in our country. And it has to be a judicious mix. We will make problems. I mean, we will face a lot of problems. And we and both. And, it's not really a slip of the tongue, but it came from the heart. if I may say so. And it is. I mean, because there would be, because this is, for millions of my countrymen, it's a matter of life and death. It's not an academic exercise. It's a matter of life and death. I mean, as and when, I mean, how this is going to be implemented. And it is here, I think that judicious mix will have to be made. And there, if I were to identify the priorities, remember, all of us talk of market economies, free market economies, etc. Today, in the Scandinavian countries where you have probably the best of your social security that the state offers, what is the tax GDP ratio there? Sweden has 55%. 55% of its GDP is from tax. And it gives everything else back to the people, from employment security downwards to everything. I mean, that's fine. And what is the rate, let's say, even in the Asian tigers, Thailand or Singapore, it's 22%. France, 37%. India, we were 8 till last year. This year, Sitaram informs us in the budget that we have grown up to 10 point something. Very good. But then, is it not an issue that should demand our attention? That how are we going to, with a 100 crore population that we have, with a few million taxpayers, and that too with the salaried sections, shouldn't we not raise these issues? That you can make crores as dividend money and not pay a paisa of tax, but the poor salary earner will have to sustain this tax structure or the state's expenditure. Now, these are the relevant questions where I think intervention is necessary, and I think all of us will have to do. Finally, I just want to say one thing. During the course of last 1 year, again, I'll be unpopular. During the course of the last 1 year, the number of billionaires in India have grown, I believe, from 71 to 311. Very good. I mean, may their tribe increase, as they say. I'm not saying don't do that. But then look at the rate of growth. They have a net worth today of 364,000 crores. And if they had to put this in a normal deposit at an 8% rate of interest, they would be earning 29,000 crores a month or 80 crores of rupees a day. And then you have 20,000 of our farmers who have committed distress suicides. And you have, Arun, whatever be the dispute over the poverty line figures, but you still have a third of our population below poverty, below $1 a day. Now, this is the mismatch which we can't afford. And this is what I'd like to end with. This is a mismatch the market in India cannot afford. This is the millstone that is going to wring down the neck of the market creativity that we were talking of earlier, unless you seriously address that problem soon. And that is exactly what Hernando de Soto, if he was here, I would have asked him. And that is precisely his prescription also in Peru, when he was saying the shining path would not have been shining if the state had intervened and not allowed the market to slide into mercantilism, as he says, and not into capitalism. So a judicious mix is what is required, and I think that is the mix which, whatever be our history in the past, let's not relegate that into saying lost decades or gained decades, but it is that we have built up so far. The correctives that are required now, let us today collectively implement those correctives. Yes, we'll disagree on many things, but then the approach on the point of a judicious mix between the market and state intervention, I think that is what is required. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yechury. Just a couple of quick clarifications. Not really. I know you know these, but just for the sake of the audience, there's the number of billionaires that you said, sir, actually, and they would deposit that in the banks if they had that money at home. Actually, sir, in most cases, those monies are actually the values of the stocks listed in the stock market, which doesn't belong to them, actually. So that would not work, sir. And so secondly, sure. So second thing which I would walk, and I had a specific question to Arun, so before we open the floor, is that the incentives and subsidies, you said very rightly, incentives to rich and subsidies to the poor. So the problem with government intervention is that incentives go to the poor and subsidies go to the rich. So therefore it doesn't work. So therefore the reform is. And since it always happens, or mostly happens the other way, I'm reminded, I was just noting it down while sitting here, that what the former US President Ronald Reagan once very famously said. He said that the 11 most dreadful words in the English language are, I am from the government and I'm here to help. So, it's sort of, it's the inefficiency, sir, that you're talking about. But sir, since I have it here in front of this audience, I just wanted your response on 2-3 things which you mentioned just now very quickly. So subsidies, the finance minister has presented a study in the parliament. He wants to correct the subsidy system, which is getting very burdensome. Half of it is what is described as non-merit subsidies. Will you support that elimination of non-merit subsidies? If you agree with it, obviously, it has to be done methodically. Secondly, sir, if you go by most of the examples, if not all, of privatizations that we had in India under the NDA government and Mr. Jaitely presided from the president, most of them have been very successful for the consumers, for the workers, if you look at the wage levels. So why would, one would exercise abundant caution, but why would you outrightly oppose and throw them out of the government? So, sir, if you could just very quickly respond on subsidy and privatization, and then I'll have one small question to ask Mr. Jaitely, and then we can open the floor. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, let me begin by saying I'm not from the government. I'm not here to help you. So you please be rest assured. If at all I want to do anything, I want to engage you in a proper, a meaningful discussion, which I hope will help all of us and the country. Now, as far as subsidies are concerned, you see, the objective of the subsidies and the manner in which that objective is executed are two separate things. Right. Now, you may disagree, and correctly disagree, and I have a host more of complaints of how the subsidy never reaches the people it should. But in the name of that, I am not going to throw the baby with the bathwater. The point is that how are you going to make this more effective? Yes, let us discuss that. But do not tell me today that it's the same logic. You see, today you say you downsize the employment, you reduce the workforce. Why? Because without reducing the workforce, you cannot grow. Since you cannot grow, you cannot create employment. And if you want employment, you become unemployed today. Now, this is the logic. You see, which unfortunately is not really, even in terms of sheer logic, it cannot stand. Now, the point at issue is the finance minister's subsidies, what the white paper he's promised to give. Yes, let us examine that. Let us see, where the subsidies are going and who's getting them. And if he's got that indirect subsidies which are benefiting those who should not require the subsidies, yes, prune that. But do not use that as the excuse now to say that get rid of subsidies altogether. And again, remember, when you're talking of level playing fields and competitiveness, etc., I mean, you have a, let's say, a football match between class 10 and class 2 of the same school, same rules. Who will win? Is there, I mean, what is the level playing field then? I mean, that is where you have to have handicaps. You will have to give these handicaps, I mean, which is there in sports and in all, most of the events. And why is that? That is the recognition of the section which is not as privileged as the others. So therefore, how are you going to give these handicaps? That is the whole point of subsidy. If you can have handicaps in racing, if you can have handicaps in boxing, I mean, why don't you have handicaps in life? I mean, people who can't afford, I mean, why don't you give them those handicaps? That is what the subsidies are all about. So therefore, I'm not in favor of doing away with subsidies. I'm in favor of more efficient use of these subsidies. That's a different matter altogether. Secondly, on the question of privatization. Now, I do not know what are the great success stories of privatizations. I mean, one of the hotels in Bombay near the airport is still stuck where it was. I mean, it's looking like a flying saucer at the moment. But I believe they could not proceed further. The other hotel is already in a greater problem. And forget the hotel's privatization. But my entire point is that privatization of public assets makes neither economic sense or common sense. Why do I say this? I say this because it is like a farmer selling his land to meet his daily expenditures. Now, the private sector in our country also, we have not been, and the public sector in our country, we have not been the votaries of that. Please remember, it's not a communist idea. The public sector in India originated initially before independence in what is famously called the Bombay Plan, prepared by the Tatas, the Birlas, I don't know if the Godreges were also there of it, but all the major industrial houses of our country. And what was the logic? That private capital did not have capital at that level in order to invest in infrastructure. And the state had to step in to invest in infrastructure so that the steel that is produced, the cement that is produced, whatever it is, that will add on to the growth of the private capitalist sector. So it was basically a capitalist idea. It was not a communist or a socialist idea. But once that stage is passed, then they say, yes, now that we didn't have money at that point of time, capital, now we have, so therefore you privatize. Fine. If you tell me that honestly, I'm willing to discuss that. But don't try and say that that is inefficient and therefore you privatize it. Today, there are more private enterprises closed down, shut down, and not because of labor problems. Please, before you attack me. Not because of labor problems. There are more private industries shut down in this country. Go to the Reserve Bank of India statistics. It will tell you nearly 6 lakh units in a country are shut down. And what is that efficiency? So do not sell to me this argument, efficiency versus inefficiency. I mean, you'll have that in both sides. That's not the issue. The issue is if you have an asset that is giving you profit, why do you want to privatize it? Yes, Margaret Thatcher's famous statement, it's not the business of the government to be in business. Fine, but why did the government have to start the hotels? 1946, Nehru convened this Afro-Asian conference. There were not enough hotels in Delhi. Private sector was asked. They said, after this conference, who will stay in my hotels? They didn't come and invest. So the government had to set up the Ashoka Hotel. So you also, keep your history in mind before you start castigating, things of the past, saying, because that was the foundations on which all of us have grown. Veerappan in the sandalwood forests in Karnataka, no private sector would want to face him. So the Mysore sandalwood soap is made by the government of Karnataka, which many of us use it even now, today. And then you say, what is the government doing in soaps? Well, it went into soaps because private sector was not going in then. So, there is a history that is also involved in it. So let us not try and straitjacket everything into it. So when I am today opposing privatization, I am opposing the privatization of your public assets. And privatizing them to meet your daily expenditures makes no economic sense or common sense. Yes, there are public sector units that are dysfunctional. Yes, let us sit down and see how you can make them functional if you cannot dispose them of. There are those that can be turned around. Let's try and turn around public-private partnerships. Yes, we are prepared to it. In fact, the pioneering work in the public-private partnerships of a public sector that was sick, which today is turned around and making a profit for the third year, is the classic case of JESOP in Calcutta, West Bengal, where our government, our left-front government, we have done this, and we say, do that to everything. I mean, do that to every other public sector, and let us evaluate, I mean, on the basis of which you do it. But let us not start off on a prejudice tirade, which is not helpful for the country or its economy.
Thanks, Mr. Jaitly. I think, Mr. Jaitly, you wanted to respond to a couple of those?
Just a brief comment. I don't think, Sitaram, at least I don't ever confuse that you speak for the government. So you need not worry on that score. We also don't hold you responsible for a lot of things that the government is doing. But we certainly hold you responsible for a lot of things that the government is not able to do. Because that kind of obstructionism certainly has come in a large part of the policy domain. Now, let me just deal with some of the points you mentioned, just to carry this debate further. You're absolutely right. We still have a large number of people below the poverty line. The figure may not be 1/3, as you mentioned. The figure declined very slowly between 1947 and 1991. The 1993 figure of BPL, the below poverty line, was 36%. 1999 was 26%. And by 2006, it would be substantially lower. But are those reasons of poverty which exist today, the reasons of unemployment which exist today, the reasons of the farmer suicide which exist today, in any way attributable to what has happened post-1991? The markets certainly are not responsible. The markets, if at all, have accelerated the pace of the economic growth. Despite that, the enormity of the problems has been such that some sectors have remained ignored. And I am one with you when you say the government has to make a judicious mix, that these are the sectors on which you have to concentrate a lot more. And therefore, I come back to my point. You need a government which is an enriched government. You need a government which has adequate money in its pockets to come out with its poverty alleviation schemes. And if we were back to the pre-1991 situation, probably that situation would not arise.
Fine.
Secondly, let me just respond. Secondly, when everybody speaks in terms of downsizing, you may speak in terms of downsizing a particular establishment. You don't speak in terms of cutting down the workforce of the country. Oversized establishments, plump establishments, inefficient establishments are not going to save jobs. They probably will collapse under their own weight of their inefficiencies. You need more efficient establishments so that even in a given establishment, for its efficiency, you lose jobs. An efficient economy generates jobs elsewhere. And that is where the total number of job creation in the society picks up. Thirdly, when you speak in terms of privatization, nobody is speaking in terms of privatization as some kind of a fad. And I don't think there is a dispute when you say, or there can be two views, that at a stage when you thought in terms of these great establishments which came up in the 50s and the 60s, probably there was no adequate private sector investment. Today, as a matter of economic policy, the government is to decide where is it that you must lock in the taxpayers' money? Where is it that you must lock in the resource of the state? Must you unlock it out of areas where private sector is prepared to enter? Or must you then divert it for use in several sectors? Even when the money goes into the Consolidated Fund of India, it doesn't go only for paying salaries. The money which will go for your rural employment guarantee scheme. Now, should you be spending in a non-core sector where private sector is prepared to come in, or unlock the resource out of that and unleash it towards a social sector spending and educational sector spending or other resources of the state? Now, that's the ideological rationale behind this debate, that particularly in the post-1991 era, when the private sector is prepared to step into large number of these areas and run them efficiently, however much we may ridicule one hotel here or there, but at the same time, let's not forget that some of the best hotels in the country were being run in the worst manner. And therefore, you had to have the government step out of them. And I'm glad even the West Bengal government has recently stepped out of some of them, which weren't running well, and probably rightly so. They must be supported on that score. Therefore, the question really behind privatization is, must we allow our resources to get locked into these areas, or allow the private sector to spend in, or divert these resources towards areas which are more deserving?
Fine. You see, let's get down to
can we just come back? So we actually just got a good news that Mr. Honanu Desato is actually available to us. We'll have him both over video and audio. So ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to have him both, and unfortunately he won't be able to hear us, but we'll be only to hear him. So he's just going to come live to us.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to hear Mr. Yechury or Mr. Jaitely, and I know I'm speaking totally out of context, and this must be as frustrating for you as it is for me. But I will then address the issue that I've been asked to, which is, can free markets serve the masses? I'll start off by saying that I suppose we're talking, of course, about developing and former Soviet nations, because I doubt that President Bush or Prime Minister Blair would talk about the masses. The masses are these amount of large impoverished sectors of the population in third world countries, like yours and mine. And the question I would briefly answer as that more people believe now, and have always believed, that actually free markets cannot help the masses. Most people believe that free markets are actually just made for elites, and actually just made for the West. This is the old argument that Karl Polanyi had already over 50, 60 years ago. These are the arguments of Margaret Mead. These are the arguments of Max Weber, who actually thought that free markets just about only helped even people who believed in the Protestant ethic. Samuel Huntington has also said very much to that effect, that it is only a certain people of a Western culture that can actually participate in markets. And he has not only referred to Muslims, he has also referred to Mexicans. In developing countries, my part of the world, more and more, certain political leaders who are now very strong, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, have actually said that our culture and our masses are incompatible with the notions of a market economy. A Colombian historian by the name of Funguito, an economist, also a former president of the Central Reserve Bank, also notes that it's not only now that we have in Latin America tried to bring in free markets. We've tried it actually since the 1820s, when we became free from Spain. And each time we have failed throughout the 19th century and throughout the 20th century. It never catches on with except a small elite. Today, China seems to also make suspicions arouse as to whether markets actually help masses. According to the government itself, it is recognized that I think over 58,000 revolts were registered last year, and these revolts had a lot to do with the lack of property rights, had a lot to do with the fact that many people do not seem to be able to participate in the market. This was, of course, something that in the United States, among certain intellectuals like Samuel Huntington, as I said before, is attributed to the fact that markets are all about exchange, and they're all about exchange among people that are anonymous to each other. And therefore, a crucial element of making markets work is the element of trust. And the question then to Samuel Huntington, like in the tradition of Max Weber, is the condition of trust does not seem to prevail in other countries except those of the North Atlantic, and certain exceptions like Japan and four Asian tigers, in regard to the majority of their populations. Lately, a study by the University of Michigan, as a matter of fact, has worldwide asked two questions. Do people in developing countries trust each other like they do in developed countries? And do people feel that they're in control like in developed countries? This study of the University of Michigan, it's a survey on behaviors, has actually brought out rather interesting results that make one pessimistic about the feeling that masses can actually be served by free markets. The numbers are the following one. When Europeans are asked whether they trust each other, about 65% of Europeans say they do trust each other. When the same question was asked in Peru, about 11% of Peruvians said they trusted each other, about 6% of Brazilians say they trusted each other, and about 35% of Indians say they trusted each other, which would corroborate the fact that most of us in the third world don't trust each other, and therefore we are absolutely not in a condition to be able to enter free markets because we lack the element of being able to make contracts among each other. I was so depressed with this kind of news that I was very glad about a month and a half ago when I was invited to the United States, and I was able then to get to, through migrations, and go into that country and tell myself, well, finally somebody's going to believe me because nobody in Peru trusts me, so I'm awfully glad that I am in the United States. And I went to the migrations, and when I was asked to identify myself, well, the first thing I said, well, I am the son of Alberto Soto and the son of Rosa Polar of Peru, and they actually came about 350 years ago to this country, and one came from Arequipa, the other one came from Moquegua, and the man at migrations looked at me in the eyes and said, look, will you just show me your passport? And I realized that when I showed him my passport, all of a sudden, the North American began trusting me. And he began trusting me because when he read the document, as opposed to when he saw me, he was already believing in what was written down. And then it came to my head what Bertrand Russell had said a long time ago, which was there are two ways of people to know each other. There's knowledge by acquaintance, and there's knowledge by description. And what the migration officer was obviously not believing was my way of identifying people in my own reduced circle of friends and acquaintances in Peru, which look at my face, hear my voice, look at my eyes, look at my teeth, see the way I walk and gait, and these archetypes tell them who I am. But when you're talking to somebody that you don't know at all, what counts is really what's on the paper. I later on went to my hotel, and it's a hotel I've been visiting for the last 20 years or so, and everybody knows me. It's a very small lobby. And when I came in, they said, Mr. De Soto, how good to see you, how pleasant it is to be with you. And at the end of the conversation, they asked me, how do you expect to pay? And I said, well, promptly, how I always pay. I'm one of the few Peruvians that actually pays his bills. And the reply was, do you mind if I see your credit card? And it's at that moment when I showed them my credit card that I was then able to understand that all this time, the attendant at the lobby never actually trusted me. He had trusted my credit card just the same way as the migration officer trusted my passport. And again, it made me realize that Kant had said, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, many years ago, that we only have 5 senses, and that therefore we need representations to be able to capture reality. The fact of the matter is that it's very hard to actually go beyond an immediate circle of about 2,500 people who know you without a document, without things that are written and set out by law. If you get an apple, and I have an apple here with me, there is nothing on this apple that says that I can own it, that I can sell it, that I can buy it, that I can lease it, that I can transfer it, that I can loan it, that I can rent it, that I can pledge it, that I can collateralize it, that I can mortgage it, that I can use it as a determinant for rates. None of that happens in apples. Apples, whether they're stolen or they belong to you, look exactly the same. The thing that gives anything a commercial value, the thing that gives anything a meaning within the market is always carried in a document. Apples themselves only say things among a very close and reduced circle that is much smaller than the free market. We have an experience in Peru with the Peruvian telephone company, the Compañía Peruana de Teléfonos. We wanted to sell it in the 1990s. And a team, some of which came from my organization, was given the mandate to sell it, to privatize it. And they went abroad, and nobody wanted to buy it until they found out that essentially they did not believe in the property title. And so what was done was go out, hire merchant bankers from Britain, lawyers from Washington, D.C., until the property rights regime over telecommunications in Peru over 3 years was changed to a point that the title of the company could be identified. And the company, which initially, when the privatization process had begun with a failure in 1990s, being valued in the Lima Stock Exchange at $53 million, in 1993 got sold at $2 billion. That is to say, at 37 times the value that it had previously when it had no title. In other words, we did not repair the broken windows in the telephone company. We didn't paint it. We didn't mow the lawn. We didn't build in new infrastructure. All we did was change its representation from being a purely physical object to being an object represented according to law, and it increased its value 37 times. What I've been trying to tell you over the last 10 minutes is that free markets are essentially markets of paper. It's essentially a system of representations and descriptions. It is not a system of physical objects. Jesus Christ threw the merchants out of the temple 2,000 years ago because they had converted into a market. That means that markets have existed for thousands of years, as you very well know, in India. But these were very small markets. These were markets of thousands of people. Free markets are markets of millions of people, where if you do not know who somebody else is, you cannot make a bargain, you cannot make a deal. We may all be brothers and sisters in this earth, but without some form of representation, if we're 6 billion people, and you Indians are close to 1 billion, I believe, there is no way of understanding or knowing each other. A symbolic system that captures information is absolutely necessary. There is nothing that you can see in a free market that is not represented on paper one way or another, whether it's a share, whether it's a bond, whether it's a title over a movable good, or whether it's a title over real estate. Everything absolutely travels on paper. And it can't just be any paper, because we have a tendency in developing countries to say that we've titled homes and that we have given certificates over ownership of businesses, and that businesses are allowed to operate if they actually don't obey a certain group of criteria that you find in all developed countries. For example, in the titling systems of homes, in all homes and buildings and land, just all over the United States and Western Europe, all titles actually fix the economic potential of assets. They are drafted in such a way that the information contained allows you to be able to ascertain the value, or allow you to have the criteria necessary to find out what the value on each asset is. The registry and the recording systems actually integrate all dispersed information. They aren't different systems for different parts of the country. It is generally one system that allows you to read the information in a standardized way, so that you can compare one object with another, or one representation with another. People are made accountable because the assets attach owners to each of the assets. The assets are attached to addresses, and addresses to enforcement. Therefore, people are made accountable. They protect transactions, and they are at the same time fungible. That is to say that they're liquid. Even good money can only be made if you actually have good property. You cannot have credit if you don't have property. We Latin Americans know it. We have issued money to have rates of thousands % over years, until we found out that to make credit available, what was essentially necessary was good property. Recently, I had a very interesting conversation with a former chairman of of the money issuing authority of the United States. And I asked him in the conversation that he was very sportive about the whole thing, what it took him to issue, what it took him to be able to know how much money to put into the market. And he said, well, it's very simple. I have to find out how many transactions take place. And I said, I hear you have a very good intelligence service. How is it that you use that intelligence service to find out how many people are making furniture, how many people are making automobiles, how many people are making personal computers? Is it the intelligence services that tells you how these objects come out of the factory? He said, of course they don't. What I actually do is look at the amount of property paper that is being transacted on the market. And that is what allows them then to know how much money has to be available. And then how do they make it available? And I said, how do you do that? Do you go with bags of money to people and let them have the money that's necessary for the credit? He said, of course not. What happens is that people come to banks. And one way or another, through addresses, through the fact that we know something about their records through the addresses, or the fact that their assets have been securitized, they are then given credit. And with this documentation, they then come to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will then rediscount it. In other words, the word credit in Latin comes from the word credibility, credere, which means I believe in you because you have something to lose. If you do not have a part of the economy that is documented as having things that they can lose, credit will not be available. And it's the same thing with investment. How is it that you can capture investment unless you're able to issue shares? In other words, property rights, little pieces of property rights over your assets that people will invest in exchange for a property right. How can you have infrastructure? How can you collect rates? How can you make people accountable for electricity or clean water unless you know not only where the homes are, not only where the buildings are, but also who actually owns them? It's the same thing with legal enterprises. Legal enterprises actually create a space that is separate from the home, from the family, so the noise of the family does not intervene, so people can be focused on the businesses. Fragmented sweatshops, bazaars, kasbahs, kermesses, clusters of micro-enterprises generally jumbled together, family and religion and business. The West makes a clear separate space for that. Not only that, the law dictates that the companies be organized in hierarchies that are different from that of the family. It is not necessarily the father who runs things. It can be an uncle, even in a family business, or it can be a son. But the hierarchy that makes decisions and brings assets together, clients and labor and creditors and suppliers, are organized through a non-family hierarchy. They also have different ways of dividing labor into different sub-functions and fabrication into different sub-areas. And collective memory is put into integrated circuits so that people are able to remember processes together. They also have limited liability, which is a total legal creation, which allows not only other people who invest to assess risk, but it also allows everybody to be able to invest, because limited liability tells you that you will never be liable in excess of the amount that you have actually invested. Also, asset partitioning. How can you pool resources together unless you have them actually represented on paper created by law? How can you actually protect investors, labor or creditors, without having asset partitioning? How can you be able to transfer human capital from one generation to the other if you don't have clear inheritance laws and perpetual succession? That in the same way that you are allowed to transfer a value and a property right to a transaction, you can transfer it also over time from generation to generation. How can you capture liquidity without bills and notes? If you don't have any of these things, then you do not have a place to organize things, and you do not have the documents that are necessary or the records that are indispensable for holding value and representing it. Now, the question that one therefore must ask oneself to answer your question, which is, can free markets save the market? Can free markets actually serve the masses? Is how many people have got property rights, as I just described them to you, How many people have got enterprises with limited liability, perpetual succession, hierarchies, a separate space really from the family in the third world? Now, there are generally not statistics available on this. As a matter of fact, I think my organization is the only one that actually compiles them and defines the informal economy as being those people that do not have the legal tools to do these transactions. And the reply is the following. In the case of Egypt, in a study that we did with the Egyptian government, the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, that took a full 4 years, we found that 86% of enterprises do not have these attributes, and 92% of all plots of land and buildings do not have these attributes or functions. And the total value of these attributes or functions was about $245 billion, which is about 90 times the amount of foreign aid that Egypt has received since the Second World War, and about 30 times the amount of foreign direct investment that it has received since Napoleon left it at the beginning of the 19th century. When we did the same study, or we're doing the same study now in Mexico, we have actually found out that 94% of all enterprises do not have these attributes, that they actually represent about 50% of employment and 60% of the people who actually receive, one way or another, their livelihood from that activity. And in the case of Tanzania, it's 98% of the population that works totally outside the legal system. So therefore, one of the very important things that happened in the West that made it possible for them to serve what were at that time their masses were the fact that they actually made a revolution. They actually made a revolution. And they changed their whole system. Dudley Smith in New York in 1850 called for the creation of companies available to everybody. Before, you needed an act of Congress. And in Europe, you needed a royal charter. In the United States, it was only in the course of 100 years that they were able to integrate their masses through over 32 preemption acts, all directed at popularizing property and giving people their access to business. In Germany, the process of popularization of property and businesses only began in 1806 with the Stein-Hardenberg reforms, and in Switzerland, which was the poorest country in Western Europe, in 1908. In Peru, we, like in Brazil, we have received over 1 million migrant families from Japan during the 1930s and 40s, including a former President Fujimori of Peru. And the reason they came to Peru and Brazil, and that President Toledo and Lula did not go to Japan, was because they were poorer than us in 1940 up until 1945. We had 2 times the GNP per capita than they do today. And it was only since 1945 when they started establishing the access to business and property to all their masses that Japan became actually a developed country. And continually today, as the Western Europe expands through the acquis communautaire, the whole process is not one of giving them further assistance, the countries that come in from Western Europe, but actually changing their property and their business law so that everybody can actually participate in it. But because the Europeans and the Americans have done this so slowly, over 150 years, it is still not well established that it is legal transformation that allows you to serve the masses. So the reply, and with this I will end, to the question is, can it serve free markets? Can free markets serve the masses? The reply is no, not unless they don't have the legal attributes to do so, because that makes that the only ones who can accumulate capital and the only ones who can organize technology properly are those who are in the legal systems. If you cannot give them the tools, it's just like with carpentry. You cannot do carpentry with your bare hands, and you can actually not build businesses with your bare brains. You need the legal you need the legal instruments to get there. And the question we have to then ask ourselves, if there are continual complaints now, if we see people rebelling against globalization, if we see that there are doubts from China to Latin America on whether the masses can be absorbed, these are legitimate rights. And it is not until we understand that it is by changing the legal system and giving everybody the legal tools with property rights and businesses that we will actually be able to destroy the myth of culture. The whole idea of the Enlightenment was that civilization was written in the singular. It didn't come with an S. It didn't mean that there were various civilizations. And the whole idea of the Enlightenment can only come around at the time that law is equally accessible to everybody. Just to end, the Washington Consensus contains 10 points. And of those 10 points, the last two are access to business and access to property rights, and they were the ones that have never been implemented. And until that happens, free markets will just simply not be able to help, not so much the poor, the excluded, those that can get very angry if they see a few benefiting and they don't get the benefits themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
He can't hear you.
Yeah, I know. I guess even if you can't hear, thanks, Mr. De Soto. I think there's something to be said about speaker not being able to hear the moderator. And I guess if you could understand Mr. De Soto as much as I did, I think the general consensus on the table was that we need the right mix. We probably have a better mix today than we had between the 50s and the 90s, I guess, Mr. Yechury can. And thanks to no measure the help by Mr. Jaitly's party for the 6 years. And I think Mr. Yechury will ensure that the mix gets better in the years to come because he has a voice in the government, more than a voice.
I'm glad you didn't have Mr. De Soto here because I think we would have agreed most of the time. Yeah, and there would have hardly been a debate.
He would have agreed with you most of the time. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we are running out of time completely. We will have no time for Q&A, unfortunately. Both the speakers have to leave and they have to be at some other function. So if you have any questions, you can probably email us. And despite the technology snafu that we had today, both our speakers are actually quite good at technology, so they will try and reply you with the email.